Okay. Got it. Okay. So once again, this is the new member orientation for Arlington Town Meeting for spring 2023. I'm going to, everybody's put their name and precinct in. I think we're too big a group for general introductions, but I would like to introduce you to the other folks who will be presenting tonight. So Greg Christiana is your town moderator, and Susan Stamps, Gordon Jameson, Steve Revelak, and Adam Oster and myself are all longtime town meeting members who will be doing pieces of this presentation for you. And Pat Hanlon, who's not here yet, will probably be doing a piece of the presentation towards the end. He is also a member of the Zoning Board of Appeals. Steve is also on the ARB. Gordon, are you an assessor now? Is that right?
I'm on board. Yes, I'm on the Board of Assessors.
Gordon is on the Board of Assessors. I am a former select person and a member of the Finance Committee. So
And I am on the tree committee.
there you go. So in addition to town meeting members, we're all doing other stuff. Is the way that goes. Okay. So we are going to start off this agenda with just a little discussion of the big picture. I'm going to start with Greg introducing himself, and then Greg, any of these topics you want to discuss until we get to resources and support system, which is going to be Susan's point. And then I might talk a little bit about how in-person is different, or Susan might do that since we've both done in-person, and there may be some folks here who have not been to in-person town meeting yet. So Greg, take it away.
Thanks, Annie. So I'm Greg Christiana. I'm town moderator, and I basically serve as the chair or the presiding officer of town meetings. So I maintain order. I make decisions about what's in or not in scope of the agenda that we have for town meeting. We'll get into details of what the agenda is a little bit later on. Let's see.
I didn't mean to pop up there. There we go.
Sorry.
Oh, it slides jumped ahead on me. I was
What?
okay.
Yeah, and so let's see, I'm going down through resources, right? So where town meeting fits into town government. So there's actually maybe someone could pop this into, like, Gordon probably knows where this is. I know you worked on this as part of Fiscal Resources Task Group of Envision Arlington, the EBCs of town government. So if someone's able to drop the link to that, it's on the town website.
You shared that link in with the introduction that went out to people, and
yeah, so folks should have seen that with a letter that I sent out through the TMM email list, and that gives an overview of Arlington town government. Where town meeting fits in is that we're basically the legislative body. So we town meeting votes on like appropriations for basically like related to the town's finances, could be like building projects, like which would be part of like the capital plan. There's a Community Preservation Act projects that are proposed that have to be approved by town meeting. CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, which has to be approved by town meeting as well. Let's see. There's what governs what we do at town meeting as far as like procedures and rules. Like generally, it comes from Massachusetts general law, which is the state law. Our town bylaws. There's like the Town Manager Act, which is also state law that's specific to Arlington and our form of government, and what powers or authorities the town manager has, and how responsibilities and authority is kind of divided between different parts of town government and town administration and so on. And there's also this book called Town Meeting Time, which covers basically the procedures and rules that are generally followed by the town meeting form of government in Massachusetts. And it's very similar to Robert's rules, but there are some differences. And so whenever we get into like weird procedural territory, I might need to refer to this for some nuances of certain rules from time to time. Usually we don't run into those corner cases very often. Let's see, there's a distinction between annual versus special town meetings. Annual town meeting happens every year. It's established in our town bylaws that the annual town meeting is held starting the fourth Monday in April each year at 8 p.m. If we were so lucky, we could finish that one night and we'd go back to our lives. But our business usually runs much longer than that, anywhere from I mean, the longest annual or the shortest annual town meeting I could think of in recent years was maybe like 5 or 6 nights, something like that. And last year it was kind of a marathon session that went 13 nights. So we'll probably end up somewhere in between there. The remote town meeting was procedurally things tended to take longer than they do in person. So I expect that, we're not going to go nearly as long as 13 evenings. And let's see, the special town meetings, because as you probably saw from my letter that you should have received earlier this week through email, we are going to be in person at town hall, and so that generally speeds things up compared to the remote format we've been doing for the last few years during the pandemic. Special town meetings can occur at basically any time. There's a process for holding a special town meeting if there's certain important time-sensitive business that the town needs to do that can't wait for the next April annual town meeting. And we often have a special town meeting that's embedded within the annual town meeting. And the reason for that is that there might be a handful of articles that were not ready or not able to get into the annual town meeting warrant at the time, which sets the agenda for what we can discuss and what's within scope of the meeting. And so if there's other business that took longer for some reason to get into the agenda or the warrant, that might go into a special town meeting, which we kind of embed within the annual town meeting. So it's just a procedural mechanism that we use a lot of times because of deadlines of when the warrants have to be finalized. Constraints, like what we can and can't do. So town meeting can do a lot. And as a moderator, I have a lot of discretion on what's allowed within the meeting. Obviously, I try to keep things within scope and maintain order in the meeting. As the name implies, moderator, it's about kind of moderating the meeting to try to keep the temperature down, especially if passions or start flaring and accusations start flying. A big part of my job is to kind of keep the temperature down and keep the meeting from running off the rails. Keep the discussions focused, like on topic. I might call someone out for scope, that if they're speaking to a topic that's outside the scope of what the meeting is supposed to be talking about, because we do have an agenda that we're covering through the warrant, which we'll cover a little bit later. And so a lot of that comes down to my call as moderator, what's in or not in scope. I get the final determination of scope. Town meeting can cover a lot of ground depending on, again, on what's covered in the warrant. And so I think someone else will cover the warrant in more detail. So why don't we move on to Susan? Do you want to cover resources?
Oh, yeah, sure. Hi, everybody, and congratulations on being elected new town meeting members. We you may have questions as we go along here. It's a lot of information. And if you do have a question, I suggest you make a note of it and we'll take your questions at the end as I understand it. So my job is to talk about resources and support system. Your immediate resource is your precinct. Every precinct is, if they have all their town meeting members, they have 12 town meeting members, most of whom have been on town meeting for some period of time and are quite familiar with the way things work. You can find your precinct, your names and email addresses of all, if not all of your town meeting members in your precinct on the town's website. There's a lot of information there. If you just put 2023 town meeting in the search box on the homepage of the town website, you will find all kinds of great information. And I can assure you that any member that you just pick out of the list to email with questions, they will be very welcoming and glad to help you. So please feel free to use that resource. We did set up a buddy system last year, where we contacted, by we, I mean the same group who's doing this presentation, where we contacted people in every precinct, asked them to set up a buddy system, which most precincts did do that. We may do that again this year. You can, I'm not sure we've decided. We can, well, anyway, I'm not sure we've decided. It's not as necessary as it was last year, where everybody was sitting by themselves with their computer, especially if they were new and like they really needed friends. And so the buddies were a huge resource. I'll get to all that in a minute. And also, okay, no, actually I get to it now. Well, I'm going to do how in person is different from online at the same time. Online, the last 2 years was a very lonely experience for most of the town meeting members. Because it certainly was for me. And I moved to town in 2010 and I became a town meeting member in 2011. That's how much of a local government junkie I am. And if, as a new town meeting member, if I hadn't been sitting there with the few people that I already knew in town and could ask them questions, what in God's name is going on? What does that mean? Why is that person doing this? It would have been much, much harder than it was. It's a huge learning curve. It's absolutely doable, but it really helps if you have someone that you can ask questions of. So you're very, very lucky if you're new this year that you're going to be doing town meeting in person. We tried to, as I said, for people who were online, we hit the buddy system. We also encouraged precincts to set up text groups. I mean, a lot of precincts did. My precinct did. Also, somebody had a Slack channel that a lot of people used, especially the second year of the remote town meeting. People in the precinct, they can do whatever they want. They can still have a text group, even if everybody's in person, because I have friends all over town meeting. You will too. And you may wonder what that person who's sitting across the hall, not with you, thinks about something. So, texting is awesome. And I think mainly what the in-person is so much better, because it is complicated, and you're sitting next to other people, they can explain to you what's going on. And another really important aspect that I noticed was that in the online experience, when people, so to speak, got up to speak, there was no room to read. They wouldn't hear the groans of like, oh my God, they're talking again, or they've talked a long enough time, or there's a lot of ways that there's a lot of human dynamics that go on in the in-person town meeting. Mostly friendly, seldom hostile, but still it's important for people who are talking to understand, do people really want to hear them say more than they're saying? Maybe people have heard enough. It's more of a group dynamic situation, which is very helpful to the process because there's a lot of material to get through. So I think that'll be great for you new people who are being able to slide right into the in-person town meeting. You won't have to put up with being online, where it was much harder for people who had the floor to know, to read the room and know really whether people were even interested in what they had to say. And I think that's really all I have to say about it. Just, look to your precinct for your support, and they'll give you all the ideas and information that you need. And
I was just going to add one thought, Susan, to what you just said. The folks who've been on town meeting for a while, there is no one that I know of who's been on town meeting for a while who will not talk to somebody sitting near them who says, I have a question, or what's going on, or what does it mean that we have to vote yes on no action? And don't have assigned seating, you are welcome to sit with your friends. Your friends do not have to be in your precinct. If you don't know anybody else on town meeting and you arrive for that first night and you want a seat buddy, look for one of us.
Yes,
We'll happily incorporate you in the group of our seat buddies and make sure that you get your questions answered and that you feel comfortable. And, you know, everybody wants everyone to succeed, to feel comfortable and to be heard.
yes,
Um,
thank you for saying that, Annie.
Well,
That's absolutely true. Everyone there is friendly and supportive and especially eager to help new people.
Yeah.
So, yes.
And assuming Mr. LaBelle does it again this year, Josh LaBelle has made buttons with names on and precincts on for everyone, and that's a great, for people who have a hard time with names like I do, it's a great way to remember names of people. Because if you haven't seen somebody in person for 3 years, you might not remember their name.
Yeah, we will all get our buttons wonderfully designed this year by Elizabeth Carr Jones, and
Okay,
they have
Oh.
your name and your precinct number on them, and oh yeah, I've seen them, they're really cute. And so we will it'll be fun, and you'll be able to tell who you're talking to every time.
Look at Steve Moore.
Hi,
Hi, Steve.
Where am I going? So Steve Revelak, you are up.
Thank you, Annie, and good evening, everyone, and welcome, almost welcome to town meeting. We're close. We're close.
Well, technically, town meeting is in session as of the town election for technical reasons, but we're not convening the actual full enclosure, but yeah.
No, thank you, Mr. Moderator, for reminding us of the importance of Article 1. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the warrant, which is it is essentially town meeting's agenda. So the warrant contains a series of articles, and an article is something that it's a piece of business that town meeting is going to be expected to act on, and act on generally meaning talk about and vote. Now, different towns have different conventions for what they put in their warrant, but in Arlington, what we typically do is the language of the warrant describes the thing to be deliberated and voted on, but without going into the specific details. The specific details you'll find in reports, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But basically, the warrant is our agenda. Now, warrant articles, you can categorize them in a number of ways, but one basic way to do it is by which body conducts hearings for it. So everything that made it onto the warrant, either because it was proposed by the town manager, the select board, or a town group, or a committee or a board, or 10 registered voters, has to have a hearing. If the article involves money or appropriations or budgets, it's going to be, the primary hearing will be with the finance committee. If it involves zoning, it will go to the redevelopment board. And pretty much everything else the select board will get everything else. Occasionally the 2 boards will report on an article, but there's always one of those 3 boards that's making kind of the definitive recommendation to town meeting. The hearing processes are basically a combination of presentations, questions and answers, and statements, but this is generally where the different bodies that do the hearing talk things over with the person proposing it, and make a decision on what they are going to recommend that town meeting do. So the select board, the redevelopment board, the finance committee, the capital planning committee, and a couple of other boards will produce reports. So if there are 2 things I want you to walk away with tonight, 2 things, and this is one of them. The reports are very important and you should definitely read them. So earlier I mentioned that articles aren't actually what town meeting votes on, and they're not. Each article will have an accompanying main motion, which will generally be contained in either in one of the town meeting reports. the main motion is the thing that you're going to vote on. So you don't vote on the warrant, you vote on the main motion. This is the second thing I want you to walk away with from tonight. The main motion is really the critical piece to pay attention to. And just, by way of giving an example, one of our articles this year, Article 43, has to do with funding maintenance of our public water system. So the language in the warrant article is something to the effect of proposing that the town appropriate a sum of money for the purpose of financing the construction or reconstruction of water mains and water facilities, and to determine how the appropriation shall be raised and expended. So notice that that's the article, minus a couple of words, but that's basically the gist of it. Notice that there's not a dollar amount, and there's no indication of where the money will come from or how it will be expended. Now, the main motion for Article 43, when it comes out in the Finance Committee report, will have an actual dollar amount and will say where the money is coming from. So that's basically the difference. The main motion is much more concrete, and it is what we do in fact vote on. Now, town meeting isn't simply a set of up or down votes on what is on the main motions that are provided in the reports. We can change a main motion before voting on it, and then vote on an amended version. So there's two processes for doing this. They're called substitution and amendment. There's not a huge difference between the two. Substitute motion is basically when you replace the main motion entirely, or if you're taking something that had a recommendation of no action and you actually want to introduce a main motion. Amendment is just, you're making a change to, making a change to part of a main motion. So any town meeting member can submit a substitute motion or amendment, and it needs to be submitted to the moderator in writing at least, I believe it's 48 hours before the article comes up. I mean,
That's right, 48 hours before the beginning of the meeting at which the article comes up, and that's 2 business days, right? Okay. So if the meeting, if something comes up on a Monday, you'd have to get it in by 8 p.m., let's say Thursday night. And so we need time to make sure, like I need to run it by town council. I need to make a determination of scope. There might be other folks I need to bring into the discussion of whether this is something that town meeting should be considering. Yeah, and to let town meeting members know as well that it might be coming. Mm-hmm. So that they can.
Yeah, so thank you, Greg. We typically refer to this as the 48-hour rule. But, I mean, there are exceptions for things like correcting typos and grammar. Those we can generally entertain on the floor. It is the moderator's decision if something is small enough to be entertained in that matter. But when in doubt, please give yourself 2 days. Now, during the process of doing this, we will have an article. We will have some number of proposed amendments, and as a body, town meeting will vote on each amendment individually, and then we will vote on the final article as amended. This sometimes involves some gymnastics on Mr. Christiana's part, because he has to figure out how to order amendments in a way that makes sense. But it is part of the art of being moderator. But just one of the things that you'll notice is that whenever there is an amendment, there will always be 2 votes. There will be a vote on the amendment and then a vote on the article as amended. And I think that's about all I had for the warrant. Anything you'd like to add, Mr. Moderator?
Great, thanks, Steve. Just one point that can trip folks up is there's various different types of amendments that come up, and they mean different things in different contexts. The kind of amendment that Steve's referring to here is an amendment to the main motion under a particular article. And so we're amending the main motion. Oftentimes the main motion is an amendment to the town bylaws or the zoning bylaw, and you can have amendments to those amendments to the zoning bylaw or the town bylaws. We could even, and that happens fairly often, you could even have an amendment to an amendment to an amendment to a bylaw, for instance, But that's very rare that someone would amend an amendment to the main motion. At town meeting time, I believe it says somewhere that you actually can't have an amendment to an amendment to an amendment, which is a good thing. But usually it never gets anywhere near that complex. Like occasionally we'll have a main motion, which will have as complex as we usually get, is like, at least that I've seen in recent years, is we'll have several amendments to the main motion. And those various amendments might have interesting interactions or interdependencies with each other. And that's what Steve's kind of getting at, that like it really matters, like the order, sometimes the order in which we take the amendments, and it can get very confusing. And so if folks are getting confusing, that might be that I'm not doing my job well. It might be that you're not paying well enough attention. But it's a big part of my job is to try to steer the meeting through these sometimes confusing situations where there's just a lot going on, and there's a lot to process. And so that's another reason to have the 48-hour rule, is that when we have multiple amendments, it gives me time to process them and determine what order we'll take them up. And also it gives town meeting members time to digest what the implications are of these various amendments to the main motion.
If I could add one more thought to that, Greg?
Yeah.
Procedurally, there are two other things that we can do to control the flow of town meetings work.
Mhm.
We can postpone an article to a time certain, yes, and we can table an article. So it is possible, for example, for an article to come up sooner or later than you expected, and for you to be startled and not have an amendment or a substitute motion that you want to offer prepared. And you can then throw yourself on the mercy of your fellow town meeting members and ask us to table or postpone that article until you are able to file your substitute motion or amendment for our consideration. I mention this because sometimes new folks will get up and make a speech in which they say, if I could, I would change this. And they can, but they have to do this extra move. No guarantee that the rest of us are going to agree with you and vote to delay our business in that way in order to indulge you. So it's better to try to anticipate when things that you think should be changed come up, which brings us back to Steve's point about how important it is to read the reports in advance, so that if you see us making changes that you think it's very important for us to amend or do differently, that you have the time, you've given yourself the time to offer your substitute or amendment.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I just add that I mean, it's pretty intuitive once you get the hang of what these different amendments are. There's only really a handful of them that can happen, and there's only maybe 3 of them that come up a lot. As far as like moving to amend or substitute, as Steve covered in detail. And then what Annie mentioned, there's postponing to a time certain. I mean, you can just say a date certain, then that's be at 9:18 p.m. on Wednesday or something. The day, and then we'll work it into the agenda for that evening. That's a majority vote for postponing to a time certain. It's a 2/3 vote to table a motion. The language we'll often use is to lay an article or a motion on the table. The table is just this abstract concept of where we put articles that are just kind of hanging out that we'll come back to later. And then there'll be a motion to to take an article off the table, which means that it'll become our current pending business at that point when it's removed from the table. And we'll do that sometimes if there's, for instance, if the finance committee, for instance, is not ready to cover certain articles, or we want to hold them back for some scheduling reason. Maybe members of the committee can't be there for a particular night, or maybe there could be, like last year, there could be negotiations going on, like collective bargaining negotiations, and we won't have exact numbers until those negotiations are done. So we might hold up certain articles for that reason. And if you want to lay something on the table, that's a 2/3 vote of the meeting. Usually it's pretty non-controversial because there's a clear scheduling constraint that we're trying to work around. And usually the meeting is pretty amenable to those changes. If you, as a town meeting member, you want there to be further there are other motions as well, which we just don't see very often at all. You can refer a motion to a committee, basically sending it back to committee. It's the kind of thing like you hear about like in like the State House or Congress, they refer something to a committee and the committee kind of, considers it sometime later on. Town meeting can do that as well. I don't remember the last time we did actually had that motion succeed or even made. And that's about, I think that's about it. Yeah.
So Adam Oster kindly reposted a link to a table of motions he put together last year, which is in chat. And I believe that's also linked to the invitation email that Greg sent for this training. So that should cover in writing what we just verbally talked through, if you're confused.
Just one last point on the distinction between substitute motions and amendments. Procedurally, they're handled like pretty much the same way. Like they have the same priorities and the rules and so on. Really the difference is that like if someone came to me and wanted to offer a substitute motion, but it was really only changing one detail of the main motion. Like if I put them side by side, it's like you're really just changing this one phrase in it. Like you should really just be using an amendment instead so that it's more clear what's actually being changed there. Because a substitute motion is basically, it's a rewrite from scratch of the motion. It still has to fit within, like all of these changes have to fit within the bounds of the scope of the original article text, which is the original agenda item. And so usually I'll encourage folks to or direct them to use kind of the most minimal means of accomplishing what they're trying to accomplish, right? So if they're changing one word or phrase or sentence, just use an amendment. There are like another one which might actually come up this year is dividing the question, where you could actually do, if there's multiple parts to the motion and there's no interdependencies between those parts, and you can really just carve up the text of the vote language and vote on them separately. There can be a motion to divide the question, which means that you would bring each of those pieces individually before the meeting for a vote. I don't know if we've done that in recent years. That actually might happen for an article this year, but so be on the lookout for dividing the question. That's it.
Cool. I think we're ready to go on to the next slide. And Adam, if you want to lead off, and we'll let Greg decide whether or not you have correctly described the job. Adam,
that's right.
Adam has also been frequently elected and probably will be reelected this year as our assistant town moderator, which is something the body does on the first night. So he's familiar with this particular role. Go ahead.
Yes, hi everybody, and welcome. I myself was just elected for the first time from precinct 20 because I moved last year. So I'm a newbie too in that respect. Let's see. So the purpose of parliamentary procedure is to facilitate the transaction of business and promote cooperation and harmony. And similarly, the role of a moderator is not just a dispenser of rules. He or she, and tonight I'm going to go with he because Greg is, I think that's his pronoun, is a facilitator of the discussion that is the beating heart of our democracy. He opens the meeting each night, recognizes speakers, and moves us through the agenda. When you speak, always address him. State law gives the moderator final authority to decide procedural questions. His rulings are final. If you are uncertain how to phrase a motion, ask the moderator. He will facilitate. Town bylaws adopted by town meeting set limits on speaking time. He enforces those limits. If you have a question about any topic relevant to the warrant article, you ask it of the moderator, and he will direct it to the appropriate person. Town meeting, you've heard this already, may not do anything outside of the scope of the printed warrant article. Motions that would do so are out of order. It is the moderator's job to make that determination. Point of order, Mr. Moderator. Points of order concern questions of process that are so urgent they can interrupt. They are special cases, but they do come up. If we are about to take a vote and you are unclear about what the vote is on or what the effect of the voting yes or no will be, point of order, Mr. Moderator, please explain, is in order. You have an absolute right to understand what we're voting on. If you think the moderator is making a mistake or has missed something, this has been known to happen. Point of order, Mr. Moderator. What's not a valid point of order is continuing debate by presenting your facts or opinion about the proposal on the floor. So, Mr. Moderator, the amendment is not within scope of the warrant. Mr. Moderator, we have not taken a final vote on the previous article. Mr. Moderator, does this require a 2/3 vote? They're also very closely related. There are questions of privilege. Mr. Moderator, there's a problem with the sound system. Mr. Moderator, the speaker is engaging in a personal attack. So you rise to your point of order, you're recognized, and you state the issue. Then what happens? The moderator decides, and his decision is final. He may consult with others first, but his authority is a little like that of a judge in a courtroom. The moderator plays these and other roles so that we can conduct business in a fair and open way. For all of his authority, he does not decide outcomes. He does not limit debate. He does not decide what town meeting does. We do. And, since the moderator is here, I'd like to invite him to comment or correct if he would like.
Great, thanks, Adam. No, I think that covers it pretty well. Just a couple of points that I could highlight here. It's very tempting, having been a town meeting member before, it's extremely tempting to think, like you'll hear someone say something and you think, like another town meeting member is speaking, and you think, that's just false. That is just like flat out untrue. And it's very tempting to think, well, I'll raise a point of order to correct the record. Well, that's not a point of order. That is like fact checking is town meeting fact checks itself. And a point of order is about how the rules are conducted, and that they're conducted within certain guidelines, following procedures, like parliamentary procedure. And as moderator, I can't realistically, and it's not really my job to fact check, unless it's fact checking the rules themselves that we're following, right? Now, if something is wandering outside scope, then that can be called out. Like oftentimes it's usually not formulated in terms of a point of order, but someone will just, especially when we're in person, like someone can just shout out scope, right? And that'll be an indication that like we're starting to wander outside permissible scope on the discussion. And just as an aside, you might be wondering, well, how are folks be able to shout out scope if we're spread across multiple locations, right? Because that's something that we haven't done before. Most folks will be sitting, they're seated on the floor of the auditorium in town hall. A small number of, the form is, the preferences form is still open until tomorrow at 9 a.m., but we have a pretty good sense so far how the numbers are shaping up. There'll be a moderate number of folks in the center balcony, like town meeting members in center balcony, and a relatively small number of folks in a town meeting members in a separate satellite room. So we're going to have the audio system set up with a deputy town moderator that I will appoint in that room, separate from the assistant town moderator, which Adam currently serves as, and we'll get that position will be elected again at the meeting. Which now a sidebar to that sidebar is that Arlington handles the assistant moderator role a bit differently from how most town meetings handle the assistant moderator. If you look at it in Mass General Law, the assistant town moderator is referred to as someone who's appointed by the moderator, who can basically take over the meeting if the moderator needs to step down for some reason, whether it's a conflict of interest or is not able to attend for whatever reason. In our case, we specifically, according to our bylaws that are specific to Arlington, we have an elected town assistant moderator who's elected by town meeting. And so I'm using the term deputy town moderator to refer to what Mass General Law typically refers to as an assistant moderator, just so we're using different terms for these different things. And so I will at some point before a town meeting appoint a deputy town moderator to oversee and maintain order within the satellite room, since I won't have line of sight to that room at all times. And like we'll have a video feed, but I won't be able to monitor what's going on in that room all the time. And so if someone from the satellite room who's participating from there shouts out a point of order, the deputy town moderator in that room will be able to turn on the microphone and kind of relay that into the microphone, hopefully not shout it out because that'd be really loud with our sound system. And then we would take that speaker to see what their point of order is, and say they would walk up to the mic. So there's some new elements that we'll be handling because of the multi-space setup that we're going to have this year. But we're going to try to model it after what we would do if we were all in one space like we had been in the past. Let's see, was there something else I wanted to discuss? I think that pretty much covers it.
I had just two things.
Yeah. Go ahead, Gordon.
When the discussion of that you disagree with someone else's opinion or the facts, that's when you put your hand up. I don't know how you may be pushing a button on your clicker, but get on the speakers list. And then you can get up and state your piece about, you can say previous speaker or someone through the moderator, you say, Mr. Moderator, previous speaker pointed to this, and I think that this is true instead. But let's say someone else also got on the speakers list and made your argument for you. There's a very good word you can use, pass, because your argument has been made by someone else. There's no reason for you to get up and say the same thing again. And the other thing is when the moderator recognizes you, Mr. Moderator, Mr. Cristiano would say, Mr. Jameson. And I would walk up and get in front of the microphone, standing in front of the body, and I would say, thank you, Mr. Moderator, Gordon Jameson, Precinct 12. So that reinforces the fact that we're talking through the moderator to the body, identifies who I am in my precinct, and then I state my piece. And before I finish, hopefully short but in sweet, I'll say either I'm supportive of this or against this, or I'm neutral. And then when I finish, I say, thank you, Mr. Moderator. And I go sit down.
Okay, I'm just going to drop in the chat. Thanks, Gordon. We're going to drop in the chat, and obviously we're a bit more casual in this meeting than we'll be when town meeting convenes. It'll be more formal and more respectful again, and that's largely a function of trying to kind of keep the temperature down, and and so I just dropped in the chat here a link to the handsets. I believe we'll be using the same models as we had in past years, which would be it's described here as the G4 model in the table at that link. And in the past, when we've met in person, we've used these handsets, often referred to as clickers, to register votes. Like it's a keypad. It looks like a cell phone from like maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago or so. But it's used for these kind of electronic procedural meetings. And the one button is programmed to, like, when we're voting, to vote yes on the motion, or like, which might be the main motion, it might be an amendment, whatever we're voting on at the time. One would vote yes, two would vote no, and three abstains. And three just basically it doesn't really count as a vote when we it doesn't count towards what's called the quantum of vote, which is like either a majority vote or like a 2/3 vote that's needed to pass a motion. And so those the 1, 2, 3 buttons are just for voting. If you make a mistake or you change your mind while the voting period is still open, you'll still be able to, and all these instructions will be shared as well, but in case folks have questions about it tonight. There's a little, if you look at the image is really small, it's hard to see, I know, in that table, but there's like a 2-line text display on the handset. And so when you press one of the buttons, like say during voting, it'll show some little text confirmation in that little digital display that says like yes recorded or one recorded, something to that effect. And you can press a different button while the voting period is still open, and it'll change your vote over. And so it won't actually be an officially cast vote until the voting period expires, and we look at the tally of the votes at that time. What we're doing new this year, because of the multi-space setup that we have with the satellite room, is that we're going to be using the handsets for requesting to speak as well, which we have not used in the past. In the past, when we were all just in the town hall auditorium, folks would raise their hands. The moderator and the town clerk would kind of note folks' hands that are up and kind of point at them to let them know that like your hand has been taken down on our list, and the speaking list was maintained that way in a very kind of manual, physical way, like visual way. And so we're going to be using the request to speak functionality, which will be, I'm still working with the vendors, OTI, who are using for the handsets, just as we have in the past. Working with them on the configuration of the buttons for the requesting to speak, whether we're going to reuse the same like number 1 button or try to use a different button so it's less confusing. We're still kind of working out the details of that, but there'll be some button that will allow you to request to speak. Like the periods in the meeting when you can request to speak and the periods in the meeting where you can vote are never overlapping. There's never any conflict between that. And so the handsets will be either in one mode for requesting to speak or the other mode for submitting your vote. I guess that's all I have on that.
Great.
I got one more thing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So you show up, you're new, you show up the first night, you walk in the front door of town hall. Your ID button should be on a table in front of you. And then you move to the left entrance where a member of the town clerk staff will check you in, and you will also pick up your clicker. And then you go find your seat and off we go.
And just to be clear, because I know there was some confusion around this point earlier with earlier communication that wasn't entirely clear about this. There's no assigned seating to a specific seat. It's going to be assigned, you'll be assigned to a particular location. But then within that location, you can sit anywhere within reason that you want, where there's a seat that's free.
Okay. So Pat Hanlon has arrived, and I'm going to let Pat talk us through a few more procedural things that we all need to know in order for town meeting to go well. I think we've already covered tabling and postponing, Pat, but you might want to talk about reconsideration, and then the rest of this is probably information folks need. And then Gordon and Greg, maybe at the end of this slide, you want to talk to the consent agenda, operating budget, and whether or not we're going to do an annotated warrant, Greg, as an additional resource. Pat?
Thanks, Annie. One of the great advantages of going near the end is that you don't have to do all the things that you were originally intending to do. And the first item here is really pretty quick too. The order of the warrant articles is set by the select board, and that's already pretty much happened. We know what the order of the articles is, and that's not going to be a thing that's likely to confuse us. So let's turn to debate. Who gets to talk and for how long? Of course, all town meeting members get to talk. But it's not only town meeting members. Actually, if you read the bylaw, town moderator gets to talk, the town clerk gets to talk, the chairs of committees get to talk. There's lots of people who get to talk. And this never really actually comes up in the course of a meeting about who has the right to talk or not. And actually, many division heads and other people are often answer questions and do talk anyway. Residents of Arlington who are not town meeting members also are entitled to talk if they're introduced by a town meeting member. And then finally, even people who are not residents of Arlington or total strangers get to talk if the meeting says they can talk, that the meeting can hear from whoever it is that they want, Occasionally this comes up and it's usually done sort of, is there an objection sort of basis, but that happens as well. How long do you get to talk? And I think that here, just remember three numbers, 7, 5, 4. You get 7 minutes to begin with. If you are moved to talk again, you have 5. And if you happen to be someone who is submitting a report and are talking about the report, you have 4. And most of us won't be in that latter situation. So 7, 5, 4 is pretty much a matter of 7, 5. These are limits and not targets. And so it's much better, both effectively and in terms of the use of time, if you are able to handle what you have to say without using this. And in my view, at least, it's only unusually that there's a need for people to speak twice on a subject. So one always has to be somewhat considerate of the time and whether and what contribution you're making to the debate. But the limits are 7 and 5 for your first time and your second time, and you don't get a third time.
Can I add a quick thought to that, Pat? That's super, super important to me. You don't have to talk. You can get up and ask questions. If there's information that you don't feel the meeting has, or information that you know because you talk to somebody independently and you think the meeting ought to have it, you can ask a question through the moderator and he will find a department head or a member of the select board or an expert or whoever is available to answer that question for you and also for the rest of the meeting.
Right,
So-
just to add to that, there might be, and where this, like the speaking limits, where there's a bit of a gray area, and I use my judgment on this, is if the proponent, say it's a citizen's petition, right? And it's brought by someone who happens to be a town meeting member who's the main proponent for that article. In those cases, what we'll typically do is we'll have, and say it's through it's an amendment to the zoning bylaw, for instance. And so first, I'll introduce the redevelopment board chair to introduce the just what was like the vote that the redevelopment board took on that article. Just a very brief introduction, like what the vote was at their board and very briefly why, and then I'll recognize the proponent of that article who may be a town meeting member who's bringing that article, and typically it is a town meeting member for them to be recognized at that point. And so they would describe, they would explain why you should support this motion. And if they're, especially if the proponent is like a subject matter expert or just has a lot of background knowledge and has done a lot of research on this topic, oftentimes they have, if they're presenting this at town meeting, and other town meeting members, when they're speaking, might have questions that the proponent might be particularly well suited for answering. And so I typically wouldn't hold the proponent to like the limit and say, well, you've already spoken, you've had your 7 minutes and that's it. If there's information or context or background knowledge that person would have, then I would allow them to answer that question. If I saw that that maybe town meeting members, and maybe it looks like maybe they're trying to like game the system a little bit and give a lot of airtime to the proponent by like lofting up like softball questions so that the proponent can speak for like half an hour, I would step in, right? If I saw that something like that was going on. But I mean, we usually don't run into that situation. So
it sometimes happens that there's a complicated subject and that the initial presentation really ought to be more than 7 minutes. And so one exception is that if you can, prior to beginning your talk, ask for additional time. And sometimes that will happen when, say, one person is giving a whole thing and otherwise you would have had a parade of different presenters that would take longer. The moderator can put that to the meeting and the meeting can do that, but you can't go through your 7 minutes and decide that you really needed 14 and ask for 7 more. Uh, At least that's not the way the rule provides. So when you get to, somebody say something?
No, I thought you were done, Pat. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I am done with that subject. I'm ready to switch over to the scope
Oh,
of
I just
debates.
had a comment about the speaking time. The 7 minutes is the limit. Most people do not talk, maybe presenters might talk 7 minutes. People who have comments, opinions that they want to voice on an article, on a motion, seldom take 7 minutes. And if they go on and take 7 minutes, every once in a while, it's useful to the meeting, but the meeting does get quite tired of hearing people talk for more than 3 or 4 minutes, is my experience. And many of us would like to reduce the allowed speaking time, but that's something that nobody's actually brought forward as a warrant article, which I think is how you need to do it. But people are encouraged to keep their comments as concise and short as possible to get their point across. And then that way we don't have a meeting that goes on just for endless nights.
Yeah, I mean, 7 minutes can fly by, just like in my experience. Like if someone's presenting just a lot of, say, technical detail or something that just has a lot of dimension to it. But to speak for 7 minutes, like just kind of like opining about something is a long time, and it's longer than most folks' attention spans in my experience. And so you're probably not going to get the result that you're looking for if you use that whole speaking time just opining on your thoughts on something without bringing some real like substance or background or context to the discussion.
It's
That's actually a great segue into the very next thing, scope of
Can I make
debate.
one quick comment, Pat?
Sure.
It's really good to use, if we have the paper, I think the packets, we're going to get packets this year. Use the back of those to take notes on, so you have an outline based upon the previous discussion. That really keeps you on track and keeps you moving. Maybe the first couple things you talk about are refuting something that was said that you disagree with, and then you ask maybe a question of someone, and then you make your conclusion. 1 second here, there was another thing.
Jameson, are you done? Gordon?
Yeah.
Okay. So scope of debate is really a fairly simple thing. Is just like as the main motion has to be within the scope of the warrant article, the discussion has to be within the scope of the main motion. And that's somewhere where where what ought to be 3 minutes turns into 7 minutes when you get wound up, and then you begin rolling all over the place and you begin talking about what the town manager did that you didn't like 5 years ago and whatever. And essentially your job as a town meeting member is to focus in on the issues that are before the meeting right then and there, and to avoid, meandering off into the wilderness. There's a certain amount of latitude that is granted because it could be difficult to hold people to this very strictly, but there does come a point when you just are down to the point where you're wasting the time of the rest of the meeting, and you have to be reminded to stick to the matter at hand. Now, one of the things that we do that isn't always done is that typically when we discuss a main motion with a lot of amendments, talking about any part of that package is usually regarded in scope. There are some places where if there's an amendment pending, you only talk about the amendment. And then when you dispose of the amendment, you talk about a different amendment or the main motion or whatever. But because we assemble the final vote at the end in the way that makes it the most convenient way to an understandable way to work through the complicated matter, the scope is usually considered not just the particular amendment that you happen to be dealing with right then and there, but anything that has to do with the chain of main motions and amendments and subsidiary motions and so forth that are before the meeting. And that actually, it can be confusing, but trying to enforce some arbitrary set of principles or precedents would not only be more consuming, but would be extremely irritating. So we don't we don't do that. So I have nothing more to say about the scope of debate. And I'm ready to switch if it's okay to termination.
Yeah, just one point on scope. There's like scope comes up in different contexts, and the basic concept is the same. But there's it's kind of applied a little bit distinctly in these different contexts. Like for instance, like there's this scope of there's a question of whether an amendment or a substitute motion is within scope of the original article text. There's also the question, and that's something that I usually decide that ahead of time, unless it's like a really simple, straightforward amendment that's very easily understandable and doesn't require a whole lot of domain expertise. The other context in which scope comes up is when people are when town meeting members are, or anyone who's recognized to speak at town meeting starts wandering outside of the scope of the article. So it's the same notion of scope of the article, but it kind of manifests a bit differently because it's in a kind of like during like basically a deliberation or a conversation, right? And so sometimes it's harder to catch real time when someone's speaking, and I do my best to catch that. But like scope gets applied in these different ways in different contexts, right? And ultimately it's scope relative to the original article text, right? Where the intention or like kind of the clear intent, if there's a clear intent of the article text that is discernible. Yeah. So Pat, you want to go on to termination of debate?
Termination of debate. And you seem to use that term, but it's the same thing that is often referred to as moving the previous question. And that's the way town meeting time refers to it. But before we get to that, it's important to know that debate can die a natural death. There can come a time when everybody has said what they have to say, and the moderator can just say there's no one else seeking to speak on this subject and terminate debate and move to and go to a vote. You don't have to have a motion to terminate debate on every time. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, motions to terminate debate are not even allowed, and you have to wait until the very end. So, so sometimes if you see that there are not that very many people who want to talk about this, rather than go through the extra time it takes to move to terminate debate, you might, if you think you've heard enough, just let it die and not go through the additional procedure, which can be time consuming. But if you do want to terminate debate before other people have finished talking, the way to do that is to move to the previous question or to move to terminate debate. And that requires a second, and it requires a 2/3 vote. And it cannot interrupt the speaker, and you have to wait your turn. So, and it can't be debated and it can't be reconsidered. Now, when you move to terminate debate, there's a question as to what it is that, when you move to terminate debate, the question is debate on what? Usually it is possible that what you mean is debate on the most recent matter before us, an amendment or whatever. But ordinarily we will say I move to terminate debate on the question and all previous questions in order to, which then drags in all of the rest of it as well. So it goes all the way up to the main motion and all of the subsidiary motions and amendments and substitutes and so forth. And you can begin the process of voting. So let me just pause there. I think that is.
I would say there's
That
one
works.
important thing that members need to remember, especially new members, is that if you've raised your hand, you've gotten on the list, the moderator has called you, and you've said, "Thank you, Mr. Moderator," identified your name and precinct. The next thing you have to say, if you want to terminate debate, is I move to terminate debate on all matters before us. If you go off in opinions, you can't do it.
And that also includes why it is you want to why you want to terminate debate. Basically, you make the motion, you get your second, and then you stand down and wait and see what happens.
Yeah, and that's to make it clear that when you're speaking at that point, you're either moving to terminate debate or you're sharing an opinion or information that's relevant to the debate. And we just enforce that we don't mix those two. Because, and it largely comes down to fairness, right? Because you could say, well, I'm just going to say this one last thing that I think is really important and that you all should know this. And at the end, you punctuate it with, and I move to terminate debate. And it's like, that's, yeah, it's like, you got to choose one of the, either make your point or, you know, you move to terminate debate.
So the next general subject is voting, and this is relative. It isn't actually completely simple, but it doesn't usually produce a great deal of difficulty. Ordinarily, a main motion will require a simple majority, which means a majority of the members that are present and voting at a meeting where there's a quorum. And so that's usually what happens, but there are some items which require 2/3. Some of those involve zoning bylaws. Generally, zoning bylaws require 2/3, but there's an exception in the recent Housing Choice Act that certain things that relate to providing particularly multifamily housing or ADUs, but only if you do it by right. There's a whole list in the zoning statute. Those can be and must be resolved by a simple majority vote. There's also a lot of other matters that are listed in statutes one place or another that require 2/3. Some of them are appropriation from a stabilization fund, incurring debt under a general or specific act, approving money for the purchase of taking of land, or actually purchasing and taking land, or transferring municipal land from one board to another, or one municipal purpose to another. And there's another list. There's a whole list of them, and they're listed in town meeting time. Usually, this is not. I mean, this is just a matter that's presented to us. There'll be an announcement in the reports about what the required quantum vote is, and it rarely becomes a matter that we have to deal with as town meeting members. But it can, particularly in some things relating to housing. I remember a couple of years ago on the ADU ordinance, there were difficulties in applying the provisions of the Housing Choice Act to decide whether certain motions required a supermajority or not. So it's always there. You need to know what it's about. But usually it's not a matter that you will have to spend much time on. With respect to procedural matters, you have the reference to the key motions at town meeting, which say what the which ones are required 2/3. We've mentioned some of them, like laying things on the table or moving the previous question. But if you have any doubt, but you won't necessarily remember all of that, and having the handy little table is a good way of reminding yourself of what those take. All right, I'm ready to go on. I'm actually going to only talk about reconsideration because tabling and postponing have already been dealt with. So the first thing to know about reconsideration is that you can only move to reconsider if you are on the prevailing side of the action that you're seeking to reconsider. So if you can't vote against it and then move to reconsider it again. Second is when you move to reconsider, usually it makes sense for you to have some reason for reconsidering that is not just saying, well, the vote went against me, but I think maybe if I get to roll the dice again, it'll go for me. And there's generally a kind of a preference in the law against reconsiderations, and moderators rarely get into trouble by turning down a motion to reconsideration that doesn't demonstrate an adequate reason why it is that it should be reconsidered. But that sometimes does happen. There is something new. Happened just last year when we had a motion to reconsider on a matter arising under the CPA grant. And so it can be important, particularly when there's just something that was missing from the first debate that people ought to pay attention to. The notice of the reconsideration is only allowed, it may be made by motion, but it's only allowed if you give a notice of reconsideration before the adjournment of the session at which the vote took place. So at the end of the meeting, when you hear Mr. Foskett and others say, we give notice of reconsideration and this, that, or the other thing, what they're doing is keeping open the possibility of a motion to reconsider down the line. It very rarely happens that there actually is a motion to reconsider down the line. But if you don't do that, then you for sure are not going to have a motion to reconsider down the line. The motion to reconsider requires a simple majority unless there's a bylaw requiring a higher vote. And I've now suddenly forgotten whether that's true of us. But I think it's a majority vote. Greg, is that right?
For reconsideration?
Yeah.
I believe this came up last year. I don't think we have anything specific in our town bylaws that vary from what it would be generally, which would be.
So town meeting time has it as a majority.
I
The
believe that's
effect of a motion to reconsider is that you've now reopened debate on the matter that you were talking about before. You haven't rejected it. You haven't changed anybody's vote. You basically just are able to pick up where you left off and continue the discussion until it terminates, either by exhausting itself or by a motion, and then you have a second vote.
Yeah, then just for completeness, I mean, this is very unlikely to come up. But there's also a motion to rescind. It's called rescission, and it's effectively a combination of a vote to reconsider and a vote to annul the previous action, like the original vote. And so in cases where it just would be kind of pointless to take two votes right after the other, where you can combine them if the outcome is that it's either going to pass or fail. But if you want to make amendments potentially to the main motion that's being reconsidered, then rescission wouldn't be applicable. But like we're getting into like one of the kind of darker corner cases.
Yeah, I don't know. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've never actually seen a motion for rescission.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty rare bird. But and usually if somebody is making this motion because there's something new to discuss, then what you'd want to do is discuss it. So you can sort of see why it's not a very common motion to make. So the final thing is what happens after town meeting is over. And now that we're meeting in person, I hope that we can manage it so that there's a party at the lawn of Jason Russell House with adequate beer and celebration, and we can do whatever a person is allowed to do after 11 o'clock. But short of that, we get to go home. Some kinds of zoning, some kinds of bylaws, when you have bylaw amendments, they have to go to the Attorney General to be approved. And the Attorney General's municipal law unit will compare them to state law, figure out whether or not they conflict with any matter of state law or whether they're within the authority of the town. And we will actually have, I think, in this time, a situation where the Attorney General turned down a bylaw amendment that we did last year. And we're going to have to pick up the pieces from that. With zoning bylaws, if the Attorney General eventually approves them, that dates back to the time of the vote. And if there is and for a regular bylaws, my recollection is that, I mean, a town bylaw, that they would take effect from the time that they're approved, that they are not retroactive. Other matters don't really involve that question. So if you're just accepting something from, as a matter of state law, a state law provision that is subject to local acceptance, that wouldn't apply. It doesn't apply when you make appropriations or authorize transactions in land, or a very large amount of the work of town meeting does not go to the Attorney General, but bylaw amendments do. And that brings me down to the end of what I have to say, but then there's a little dash, and Gordon is going to talk about the consent agenda and other matters.
Thanks, Pat. That was a great job. Everyone's done a great job.
I just want to interject, and there was some commentary in the chat. I think Mr. Baudouin made a comment about reconsideration potentially requiring a 2/3 vote in our town bylaws. I did consult with town council about when this came up last year, but I think the reference, if you're referring to the section that I just quoted here in the chat, it mentions a 2/3 vote, but that's just giving this is about the computation of quorum, which is something different. If there's another citation about 2/3 vote, feel free to share that.
I thought reconsideration required 2/3.
Yeah, I'll continue looking that up, but yeah, go ahead.
So is my screen share on? So we've heard lots of great things about what to do here. And so you're a town meeting member, and before a town meeting, how can you prepare?
Gordon, did you want to share your screen?
Yes, I did.
Okay, you should be able to do that now.
1 second.
Yep.
Oh, I have to do it this way. Okay, which one do I want? Oh dear. One second. I thought I was going to be able to toggle through one screen. I'll just start with one.
Okay.
It's not coming up.
Remember, you've got to hit a button to,
Yeah, but the share button's not lit up.
The share button's not lit up.
Yeah.
You need to give Gordon the ability to share.
Let me close that window and try again. Oh, now we have Windows.
Okay.
My computer is not the best. Sorry.
And yeah, in case you're not following the chat,
I found what I want to share. I clicked
Okay.
on it and see if that happens.
I mean, you have to be sharing your screen, which you're not. Gordon.
They've completely changed how this works. It used to be you take one screen and then you switch between it on your own, but now they have all.
You need to hit the share button on the screen controls and choose the screen to share. And you haven't done that yet.
Yep. 1 second. I said I finally have a share button to share. I'm getting rid of all the other stuff that's popping up.
Yep.
Okie dokie. Computer.
and by the way, Mr. Baudouin was correct. It is 2/3
Jesus.
vote for
1
reconsideration.
second here. So share. Let me see. I got this, and let's see what comes up. It's asking me for documents.
So usually what happens when you hit the share button on
Yeah.
Zoom controls is it shows you the things you can share in a screen.
It did, but under
then
basic,
you
it shows
choose
me all the
one.
windows I can share.
Yeah, and then you choose one of those windows and then you hit the
Okay.
share button again.
Okie dokie. They changed this since I last used this.
Okay.
I'm sure I'm glad we're not going to do a town meeting over. Zoom.
Okay, so this is not the one I wanted, but we'll do this one anyway.
Okay.
Okay, so this was what I was going to get to eventually. So as we discussed so the thing is,
It's
you're
not,
preparing for town meeting.
it's not sharing your screen yet.
Or is that better?
There you go. Okay, we got
There you
it.
go.
So you're preparing for town meeting, and here's the warrant that we've heard about, right?
Yeah.
This is okay, and the warrant has, Article 1, which is we elect people. And we get down to the articles that we deal with, okay? All the fun ones, like state of the town address, reports of committees, appointment of the wooden measure of wood and bark, and we get down to business in Article 6. Okay, so now I want to change my screen. Let's see how I can do that. Let's see if I can
I
do
think
that.
you have to reshare because you only shared.
Let's see. Nope. Is it? Can you see Article 6?
I see Article 6 in the warrant, but I do not see whatever.
That's what I want. That's
Yep.
what I want.
Yep.
So this is what, if you go to the annotated warrant, which is something I'll get back to,
Okay.
you'll find Article 6, and you click on Article 6, and this tells you all the information about Article 6 that's known. Amendments, substitutes, all that stuff, and the reports of the committee. Okay? So you can do this in paper, because there are town meeting packets out, or you can do it this way. Now, back to where I wanted to start. Well,
Oh, and I just want to highlight briefly, Gordon, like, so notice here,
Yeah.
like, we're just referring to like Article 6 bylaw amendment, Article 7 bylaw amendment. These are amendments to the bylaws. Again, these are distinct from
No. So this is
motions
what
to
this,
amend a main motion. You can have amendments on these, but those are different kinds of amendments, which can be confusing. Go ahead, Gordon.
yeah, so the first thing I wanted to show you was the primer. Okay, because the primer tells you all about our town organization. It tells you about town meeting. It tells you about the government. It tells you about taxation. It tells you about how budgets are done. But you all got a link about the Fiscal Resource Task Group, which I co-chair, primer. It has a few outdated things, but it gets you the general drift. The next thing I wanted to talk about was here in town meeting. Then we have town meeting showing.
No, you're still showing the warrant. You have to close your share and share something different because all you shared was the warrant document.
Okay, so let's do this. We'll go to town. You go to the town website. Here's town meeting, and you scroll down. And guess what you find? You find several things.
Okay, Gordon, you're not sharing your screen. Do you want to just drop the link in chat and I'll open it up?
One
and
second. I'll reshare the screen. I'm sorry.
Okay.
It used to be much easier. Since I last did this, they changed it. So you could just switch between screens before. Okay, share screen. Did I share? No, I
Not
have
yet.
to choose to share again. This is
Yes.
just. Nope, not that one. Okay, how about that? That's done.
You're not sharing it. There
Sorry.
you go. Okay. Hang on one
So
second until it gets there.
are we looking at?
Not quite there yet. Give it a second.
Okay, my computer is not.
There you go. Now we are
Okay.
looking at. So you want to
Oh,
click
one
into the
second.
annotated
I
warrant.
have to find you have to get my screen to what your screen is. So if you go to the town website, under governance, you'll find town meeting, and you click on town meeting, and you get to here. You scroll down, and guess what? You have a couple things. There's the warrant, which has the preview of what's happening, okay? And then we have the annotated warrant, which concludes all the reports that we just discussed and the substitute motions that have been proposed. So you get a whole package there. And then down here, there's special town meeting warrant too. But these are the reports that people have ever been talking about, okay? If you want to look at the budget, it's not there yet. The FinCom report will be there somewhere.
Yeah,
And
it's
that's where the
just
budget
finished
is.
today.
Oh, yeah, Annie's on the FinCom too.
Yeah, they just finished it today.
Okay, so let's see, I got my list here. So it's important again to reiterate the fact that the warrant itself is just a preview, a warning of what's going to be on the agenda. It's not the actual vote. So we get every year, someone gets up and asks us a question about the warrant, and they're not asking a question about the vote that's before us. So just keep that in mind when you're asking questions.
And also, I just add that the warrant article text, like you say, like Article 6, and there's some text there, and it's like a couple of sentences or so.
Right.
That text is not amendable. Once the warrant is closed and it's published by the select board, the article text is fixed. It is immutable at that point. And then going forward, the vote language is what's amendable. That vote language that includes the motion that town meeting is taking under that article. And so the motion is amendable, but the article text is not. Like that is basically set in stone once that's published by the select board.
Thanks,
Right.
Greg.
So if somebody filed a warrant article to say, we want to make chocolate ice cream the chocolate ice cream flavor of Arlington.
Or address any matters therein.
Or address any matters therein. Okay, you could not change the wording of that article, and you could not amend the article to say, no, I want us to declare strawberry pie our favorite pie. You might be able to, at the discretion of the moderator, suggest that vanilla would be a better choice than chocolate via.
Yeah, and so one approximation for this notion of scope, like what's within scope of the article, is I've yet to find a case where I think this doesn't apply, but it's at least I think it's a decent approximation for a litmus test. Is you look at the status quo before any actions are taken under the article, and then imagine what's the most you could possibly do. Like what's the most change that can be affected under this article based on how it's written. And that's kind of like a maximal interpretation of scope. And then imagine like in this, like conceptually, like visually, there's a whole range of options between doing nothing and doing the maximal thing that you could possibly do within the article text. And so there's this whole spectrum of possibilities, this range of possibilities within that kind of swath of, options that we have. And so amendments, substitute motions, and so on, like those would explore, can explore that range of options. But if you start to go beyond what's kind of maximally specified in the article text, and you start to go like out here, like way off the screen, then that's going to be out of scope. If you try to do something that's not really in that line, but it's like over here instead, that's also going to be out of scope, generally speaking. Now, is vanilla ice cream in the scope of chocolate ice cream? Well, maybe. If vanilla lacked any flavor, and it was just like the base that ice cream uses, like devoid of any flavor. Vanilla actually does have its own flavor, and there could probably be debate maybe about that. But if there was like a flavorless form of ice cream, then that would probably be within scope, hypothetically, because it's not chocolate. It's basically taking something away from the maximal interpretation of the scope. And this comes, and so you'll see a wide range of ways that articles are written. Some of them are very detailed and specific, and others are very broad, and you get everything in between. And so there's trade-offs to that. If you have very specific article text, and I had an email chain just recently on this sort of topic, on one of the articles that's very detailed. And so when it's very detailed, whoever was like the proponent of that article may have wished to limit what could be amended by that article. You have other article text, if it's very broad, it can be, it has a lot of exposure to wide-ranging amendments, which might be a good thing or might be a bad thing, depending on how you look at those actions that might be taken under that article. And so you'll see just lots of different, sometimes there'll be like dollar figures in the article text, but more often you won't see any specific dollar figures. And if there are dollar figures in the article text, then oftentimes, like say an appropriation that wants to appropriate $100,000 for some project, if that number $100,000 appears in the article text, we can appropriate less than that. You can amend it down, like if the vote language said, okay, we're going to appropriate from this fund $100,000 for the purposes of this project and so on. If that's the vote language, like basically the motion, that can be amended down from $100,000 to $50,000, because that's still within scope. Because again, it's looking in terms of if we did nothing versus if we did the maximal thing, are we somewhere in that range, in that dimension of what's being changed there? And so it's kind of by magnitude. Can we go? We can't go beyond what's what the maximum magnitude is in the article text, if there is a maximum magnitude actually specified, and we can't go in a different direction from that range, if that makes sense. Like in mathematics, we'd call it interpolation. You can interpolate from doing nothing to doing the maximal thing under scope, but you can't go off in a different direction. Yeah, I think that's probably more than I need to say about scope.
That's great. Gordon, if you could stop sharing your screen, I would just like to open it
No,
up.
I was going to do something. I have a few more things.
If you can be quick, because we're at time and I'd like people to be
Well,
able to ask questions.
so you've looked at the primer to understand how Arlington works. You've looked at the reports, including the budget. Okay, you've looked at the warrant, but you realize the annotated warrant or the reports provide the votes that are going to be for town meeting. You make sure that you're on the town meeting member email list that's down here in the bottom, because all the updates on substitutes, amendments should flow through that to you, so you can get that on your email. The next thing that you need to consider is that a huge source of information for questions you may have about specific things, especially things relating to the budget, can be answered by department heads. They and other members of the management of the town town manager's office and the select board, and often the school committee and ARB and everything, they are present on the floor in the front of the building, of the room, and you can talk to them before, you can talk to them as what I call halftime, or you can talk to them after to get some of your questions asked there. You might want to even go off and find on ACMI a past first town meeting member. You can look at all the pomp and circumstance and see how things get going. And then finally, we may or may not have a consent agenda. That's something that we take up at the beginning of the meeting to get rid of things that are sort of perfunctory, and we just go boom, 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 and they're done. But my personal evaluation of the warrant this year is I don't see merit in that process. And I am the person who has done the annotation of the consent agenda over the past several years, and that's where that experience comes from. I'm sure the moderator has some comments.
Yeah, so I do plan to have a consent agenda this year. It's mainly going to contain articles that are routine recurring articles that we take up every year that tend to not be controversial, as well as articles that have a recommended vote of no action from the reporting board or committee who voted on that recommendation. And so if the select board, the redevelopment board, finance committee, and so on, if their recommended vote is no action, then it appears on the consent agenda. The one exception to that is that even though an article might be no action, town meeting members have the opportunity to submit a substitute motion, and that would have to be voted on by town meeting whether or not to accept the substitute motion, and that's a majority vote. And if it passes, then that becomes the main motion. It replaces the recommended vote of no action, and the substituted main motion would. And it's always in the form of a substitute motion, because I mean doesn't really make sense to amend a no action. You're really just substituting it wholesale at that point. And then the meeting will vote on that. And then that new substituted main motion, it may require a 2/3 vote. It might require a majority vote. More often it requires a majority vote, except most zoning stuff, most zoning business, as we covered earlier, tends to be 2/3 vote with some carve outs. And let's see. Is there anything else to cover there?
Questions? So folks want to raise their hands, I'll call on you in order. If you know how to reuse the raise hand function, or you can physically raise your hand because I can see you all. Adam, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much, Annie, and thank you to everyone who presented tonight. It was very informative. At the risk of opening a can of worms, are there any sort of guidelines having to do with attendance? If people come late, if people leave early? I mean, obviously we need to be there for everything, but there are issues with with being quorate or whatever it's called.
So there, you are not required to attend every session of town meeting. Obviously, we would love you to do so. You are not required to be on time or stay till the end. Obviously, we would love you to do so. Almost everybody at some point has a conflict. They may become sick. They may have a child that needs their attention. They may have a business meeting or a work conflict that crops up, so on and so forth. What happens if you are not on town meeting floor is you don't get to vote on whatever our business is that night. So that's really how you want to think about it. And similarly with, leaving the meeting before the end of the meeting. If you have a 6 a.m. work call the next morning, you may want to consider coming for half of the meeting. So, however, you should also note that all of your votes are recorded and the votes you don't take are recorded. If we have a 6-session town meeting and you're there the first night and the last night, your constituents will know. So that's my answer.
Yeah, and there's a technical answer, like beyond just, I mean, there's like the expectation, social pressure, constituents, as Annie said, maybe looking at voting records and saying, wait, this town meeting member has voted on so little, like, why do we have this person representing us? There's also on a technical level, the meeting requires quorum, but like I mean, the bar is actually, and depending on, it's low or it's high, depending on how you look at it. It's low in terms of it's, is it 60? I forget what it is. It's basically like 1/4 of.
It's like 80 something.
Yeah, it's
Well,
80.
it's like 63 or something like that or 65, 1/4 of 252. But for certain bonding issues, it has to be 85, which happens to be, I think, there's some formula that it conforms to. Anyway, you can see the details in the bylaws. We're always well above those quorum requirements, largely as a function of being a representative town meeting, where all town meeting members such as yourselves are all elected. Most town meetings in Massachusetts are actually open town meetings where it's registered voters get to vote at town meeting. They don't have representatives, and they oftentimes, depending on the town, can struggle to achieve quorum. Because if there's just nothing particularly provocative or interesting or on the warrant, then they might struggle to get. There was actually a story just recently I was reading about a moderator who, I forget which town it was, called the local pub to get folks over to town hall so they could reach quorum, right? We don't have to worry about that because mostly the town meeting members, they tend to be more engaged than, say, the general population.
All right, Mr. Moore.
Yeah, thanks. I have a whole list of questions, but honestly, I'm not going to ask them all because it's late and I can ask someone offline. But I do have a few I want to ask now. First, there's no hybrid approach this time, right, at all?
That's right. The special town meeting warrant, which was just released or just published on the website today, there is an Article 2, I think it's Article 2. Which was brought forth by the Town Meeting Procedures Committee. There's a typo in the report. We'll get the name of the committee corrected, but it's basically it's recommending the creation of or it's moving to create a hybrid town meeting study committee. Still has to be there'll be a hearing by the select board actually the first night of town meeting before town meeting starts. The special town meeting won't be picked up until I believe it's the May 3rd. I think it's the second Wednesday, if I remember correctly, of town meeting. And so it's something we have to study. We actually don't have the legislation in place to do it unless we invoke, unless I as moderator invoke kind of like a health safety exception that would be passed, would be a recommendation to the select board who would take up a vote, which is the same process that we've done in the last few years to go remote. We actually technically could go hybrid through that same process. It'd be hard to make that case given that we're already making plans for an in-person town meeting, which we expect to be safe. And so the law basically currently comes down to, you can do in the past remote, and as of like a few weeks ago, you can also do hybrid participation if it's not safe to convene in person. The measures that we're taking, I believe, and most folks believe, will be sufficiently safe given where we're at with COVID levels. But going forward, the study committee would potentially look at maybe filing home rule legislation, for instance, to allow Arlington to operate under more relaxed rules for allowing hybrid participation and what technology would be needed and the costs and so on. That'll all be covered in debate at town meeting. But that's where we're at currently in the status of hybrid participation. It's allowed by the law, but only if the moderator and the select board agree that it's not safe to convene otherwise.
Okay, so we're not planning on doing it this year at all, which is fine,
Correct.
because you laid out the 3 locations and such.
Right.
All right, second, has there been any progress on trying to make the presentation materials that are projected larger, much brighter than they have been in past years? That's always a super weakness, and I'm hoping we've fixed it.
Yeah, so currently, like, all those materials will be reviewed by me. We haven't detailed the guidelines on that as far as font sizes, color contrast, fonts, for instance. I was actually just recently looking at like Lexington for their town meeting. They have a very detailed set of guidelines about presentation, which I think we should look at as a model. I don't know if we want to do it exactly. I don't know if we want to get it like as detailed as they are, because there's a lot of specificity in those guidelines. But we don't have any guidelines like that in place currently. But I think that is a priority for us to be able to nail that down. And so what I'll be doing this year is I'll be considering those sorts of factors when folks submit slides and so on, like presentation material that they want presented at the meeting. I'll make sure to give them that feedback and point to at least, even if there's informal guidelines that I give at this point, until we have something that's formalized.
Great, that's news. That's always a weakness, I think.
Often, excuse me,
Oh.
Mr. Moore.
Yes.
Often people who are making a presentation, who are proponents or strong opponents of an article will present slides in advance or presentation in advance in the annotated warrant. Another option that might be considered, so that there's lots of information, all that stuff sort of piles up in there below the main vote.
Yeah.
And the report from the reporting body. The other thing that could be that you may be able to utilize, although they don't always focus on the screen, is having an iPad or something where you could look at the ACMI broadcast live. And finally, the moderator might consider in the future making the screen that's projected a feed that is available in the hall. That's all.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. That's helpful. And just lastly, during the remote town meetings, there was always a status screen about who was waiting to speak and how much time was left, et cetera, et cetera. That now won't be happening. I must say that it was pretty useful to see how many speakers were in the queue and such when it came to moving or not moving the previous question. I'm wondering if is there any ability to show that in the hall?
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for the question. It's the logistics of the videos, managing the video sources. It's basically going to be, given the complexity of the multiple spaces that we have, it's essentially going to be like a television production, right? Where there's multiple cameras switching to, and the folks who are staffing the kind of video switching equipment, they'll be listening for my verbal cues. Like if I say, let's take Ms. Jefferson from the satellite room, that'll be a verbal cue to switch the video over to the satellite room to make sure their microphone is on and so on. And so there'll be a lot of switching like that going on, which we wouldn't have had to do in the past when we're just meeting in one space. And part of that, one of the displays that we can show at any given time, like say like on the main projected screen in the auditorium at Town Hall, is the speaking queue.
Great.
Now, when we were remote, you raised a great point about how like everyone could see the speaking queue at all times. And the difference here is that it would be prohibitively challenging given the systems that we're connecting for this particular town meeting to be able to show the speaking queue all the time. Like you can imagine, for instance, like a picture-in-picture or something of like the next 3 speakers or something, like an on deck or something. we're not able to do that this time. And what we'll be able to, so we'll try to approximate the sort of visibility that we had when we were remote, but with the understanding that we can't display that screen all the time. We have to switch between the video sources, and there's technical reasons for this. And so I might ask every so often, like between speakers, okay, and I'll try to work this out with the folks who are managing the video source switching. Like if they could do it without my verbal cue, that would be even better. That when we're between speakers, they switch over and show, at least for a few seconds, the speaking cue so you can see it. So you won't be able to see it all the time, but I'll try to ensure
Okay.
that you're getting a glimpse of it every so often, like between speakers.
Great, thanks so much.
Greg, will the request to speaker button also have a request to take yourself off the list if you so see fit?
It will, and it will have that functionality to cancel your speaking request. And it'll, just like with the voting in the past, where it confirms in that little 2-line digital text display to confirm your vote was yes or no, or so on. It'll also have some text in there that confirms that you've been added to the speaker queue. And it'll also confirm if you've removed yourself from the speaker queue. And so, yeah, when you have the handsets, make sure you're looking at the display to ensure, and it won't just flash it up and disappear. I'm told, at least from our vendor who's providing this capability, that it'll stay on that display until like that you've requested to speak, and that has been registered with the system. And until the mode gets switched over to voting, or the speaker queue gets cleared for the entire system.
Okay, Mr. Holland. You're on mute.
Try pushing the space
Yes.
bar.
Can you hear?
Yes, I can hear you now.
So to practice, thank you, Mr. Moderator, Aram Holman, Precinct 12. Thank you all very much for doing this. I'm much less at sea than I was when I did this years ago. 2 detailed questions. If they're too detailed, feel free to say it's not the time. 1 question on what's the relevance of when a board recommends for or against a motion, of what relevance is that to town meeting?
I mean, that's ultimately up to town meeting members to decide. Now, if the recommended vote is no action, this is always a weird case, and it's very confusing, because like, why do we even vote on this? There's actually some towns, I've talked to like one moderator who doesn't even take votes anymore on the no action articles. And so that's something to, I mean, I think our solution, or at least the solution that I'm going to stick with for now anyway, is that the no action articles will just remain on the consent agenda. And if someone wishes to pull them off, then they really need to have a substitute motion, or else we're going to have just basically a fairly meaningless vote that we just have to procedurally do. As far as if you're asking what weight should town meeting members give to the recommended vote, or is that the question? Or?
No, what you said earlier about putting it on the consent agenda, this is what I found confusing before. Is there a difference in how you handle it? And it sounds like there is. Based on whether, say it's the redevelopment board recommending for or against something.
Sure.
Do you handle it differently depending on whether they recommend for an article or against?
I handle it differently in that I'd say the bar for a no action, like an article that has a recommended vote of no action, the bar for it to appear on the consent agenda is essentially non-existent, right? Because it'll just be automatic. I'll just automatically add it to the consent agenda, unless if someone files a substitute motion that I determine to be within scope before our first meeting, and within 48 hours, 2 business days in advance, and I consider it within scope, then I'll just gladly remove it from the consent agenda, because it won't be a no action article anymore. For articles that have a recommended vote from a particular board or committee in their report, I'm looking at whether these have appeared on the consent agenda like in recent years, and whether it appears to be particularly controversial, and also a conversation. So that there's more kind of semantic parsing of what's actually going on with that vote, looking at it kind of over time. Has this been controversial in the past? Has it remained on the consent agenda when it's come up before in recent years? And also I ask the committee and board chairs for the articles that I've kind of like pre-selected to be on the consent agenda. Is there anything peculiar about the handle, like the vote language or the implications of our vote on those articles this year that like really should be brought to the attention of town meeting and shouldn't be kind of swept away onto the consent agenda, and folks might not notice it, and maybe it's important that they do. And so I have those conversations as well. And there are some that have been removed from the consent agenda because there is something kind of different and peculiar going on this year versus past years that would make it more interesting to town meeting to discuss.
Could I take a quick crack at Aram's question?
Sure, go ahead. Adam.
The recommendation of the referring committee is the main motion before us at the start of the process. It requires a majority vote to change in any way. That's procedurally the significance of the recommendation. I'm done.
Okay, that makes some sense. I'll leave the other question because it's getting late. And again, thank you very much, all of you.
Great, thanks for the questions.
Susan.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions. And thanks to everybody who's come and who's spoken and everything. On the consent agenda, this is a relatively new thing in town meeting, and I question, well, I may have misunderstood, Greg, what you were saying about how all the items that a board recommended no action on, you are thinking of putting on the consent agenda. But
If there's no substitute motion for it.
okay, because I mean, I'm thinking of citizen petition articles, which, for example, the artificial turf article was submitted by citizens by 10 signature. And it went to the select board, and the select board voted no action.
Right.
But I think that would be not appropriate for the consent agenda, because clearly people want to talk about it. So I'm not.
Right, yeah, this is Article 12 for folks who are.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's what you were thinking of, or.
I mean,
Yeah, that's
just-
true. And so I mean, I've been having conversations with folks on this article, especially with the proponent of the original citizens petition, and so there's a back and forth, and this is pretty typical, where there's a back and forth about ensuring that the motion is within scope. And if the proponent is unable to get it into scope, then it won't be considered by town meeting. So in this particular article, Article 12, at this moment, I don't have a substitute motion that I've approved of as being in scope, and I think it's probably pretty straightforward for that. I don't want to kind of like speculate too much, but I don't think there's a whole lot of work to do to get that substitute motion within the bounds of scope. And I work with folks on this, like within reason. Like if someone, for instance, and just this is a broader point, if someone comes to me and asks about like how they can strategize to get a particular outcome at town meeting, I'm not going to engage in those kinds of conversations. Like I'm not going to engage, especially in conversations that are like strategizing or like how to game the system, anything like that, right? But if someone comes to me and tells me what their intention is or what they're trying to accomplish, and they're trying to understand procedurally how they do that, like how do they need to word something so that it does remain in scope? Like if their intentions are to remain in scope, how do they actually do that? I'm happy to engage in those kinds of conversations to discuss how they can do that. And also, and refer folks to town council to make sure that things are remaining within the bounds of the law. Although interestingly, being in the bounds of the law is not a requirement of something being in scope. I don't make legal determinations, I make scope determinations, but most proponents or I'd say potential movements who wish to move to amend or substitute a motion, usually under most circumstances want to be within the bounds of the law. And so it's usually a good idea for them to talk to town council. And so on this particular article, there's still a little bit more work to do. It hasn't been finalized yet. I haven't approved of a substitute motion that'll be recognized at the meeting. But I think there's a high probability that it'll probably get there. And as you said, there's a lot of interest in this. So I'd be surprised if it didn't happen. But
Okay, so you're saying that if there's a substitute motion, that it probably wouldn't.
I would automatically remove it from the consent agenda. at that point, yeah.
The actual question I had very quickly was, there's been a lot of conversation over the last several years of the order of the speaking queue. Are speakers going to be taken in the order in which they say, I want to speak? Or is the moderator going to exercise some discretion about which of those people will be called on in what order? As you know, there are certain people which speak a lot and others who don't. And sometimes it's also distributed where a lot more men than women speak. And there's been discussion of just sort of, not just taking people in the order in which they click, yeah, I want to speak. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are for this year. I know you tried to balance everything pretty fairly last year, Greg, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that this year.
Right. Actually, before I get to that, because there is a question in the chat I just want to get to,
Okay.
so I don't forget. It's a question about from Mr. Moore. Wouldn't it make more sense to allow TMMs to place a hold on any item that has been put on the consent agenda, regardless of how the original offering committee acts on it? So I think there's a misunderstanding there. Maybe I was unclear. Any one town meeting member can hold an item from the consent agenda, and it will come up in our kind of natural sequence of articles at that point. Last year, there was I've required that there was a second, and that didn't really change the outcome, and it just kind of slowed the meeting down. So I've eliminated that this year. So we're reverting back to the rules from 2 years ago, where any one town meeting member can hold from the consent agenda, regardless of whether it was a no action or a favorable action by the reporting board. The one exception to that is, if a town meeting member attempts to hold a no action article that doesn't yet have a substitute motion, I will employ social pressure of the meeting to ensure that they have a substitute motion ready by the time that article comes up in the natural sequence of articles. Otherwise, they're really just wasting the meeting's time because there's nothing meaningful to vote on and we just have to take a vote anyway. Okay. Back to your question, Susan. Let's see. What was the last part of your question? I processed the question.
The speaking queue, are you going to take people in order, or are you going to exercise some discretion over?
Right. So yeah, I will exercise discretion in the speaking order. That is the moderator's discretion in general. I just seek to do that in a transparent manner, which means that if I do take someone out of order, you'll see like the time sequence of the speaking requests when we do actually display the speaking queue, which again, this year will be intermittent because of limitations in our video switching technology when we're in person. And if I do skip speakers, say I take like the fourth speaker down, again, if for no other reason than social pressure, I feel compelled to explain to town meeting members why I'm skipping folks in the queue. And so some of those reasons might be, as you suggested, and this happened last year on occasions, where if we have a lot of male speakers and there's like a female speaker further down the queue, I might take that female speaker out of order. If there are a lot of speakers who've been kind of like town meeting veterans who we just hear from quite a bit, and then someone further down who might be new or we just don't hear from them often, I might take that person out of order as well. And also this happened last year as well, where if there's someone who's speaking on a lot of different articles, I might take other speakers who requested later than them to speak ahead of them. And so I'll do the same this year, and I'll try to be as clear as I can when that's happening, especially now that folks won't be able to. I see the speaker queue at all times only because there'll be a separate display set up on my desk, which will have that so I can see it at all times. But we only have the one main display in town hall. If we had a secondary display where we could show that, that'd be a different story, but that would be more complicated than we can handle for the setup of this meeting. So yeah, I will take speakers out of order and I'll explain it when that happens.
Okay.
Mr. Rosenthal, do you have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Hope this isn't too silly, but my only experience of town meetings so far has been during COVID when meetings have been remote and it's been conducted over Zoom. So this is not a question so much about rules as about what town meeting members actually do traditionally. It has to do with the use of a computer, of a laptop, because during the Zoom meetings in the past, I actually have found it incredibly helpful to have a computer and keyboard right in front of me. Not that I like seeing people in little boxes on the screen, but I do like being able to go to the annotated warrant and click on something and be able to quickly get to the relevant report. I like having an editor right there so I can organize my thoughts in advance of speaking, things like that. But there's the logistical question of if I bring a laptop with me, if the battery runs down, what do I do? Where do I plug it in? Is it going to be awkward having it on my lap for 3 hours? Do people or have people in the past brought computers with them to town meeting, or is it entirely done with old school technology like pen and paper?
So we traditionally we've done this with pen and paper. People, now that they have cell phones, will sometimes use their cell phone to communicate by text or something like that with one another across the hall. Which is just another way we can sort of chat amongst ourselves about where we at on this article. There is internet available in the hall. There is not going to be an easy place to plug in. So if you have a battery that'll last 3 hours and you want to bring your laptop and you want to have your laptop in your lap instead of a stack of paper, you're going to have something in your lap. It's probably not a problem, or a tablet or anything else that has an internet connection and will show a website. I'm personally probably going to experiment with some combination for the same reason, because the annotated warrant is easier to deal with. However, part of the purpose of the annotated warrant is so that you can easily read all of the things attached to it before you arrive at the meeting. Because certainly those of us who are used to getting pieces of paper on our chair or from the table at the back of the room the night that we arrive, we always were frustrated about keeping our papers organized and getting things that night that we needed to read that were relevant to an article, and the annotated warrant is a big innovation. So I would suggest pre-prep and see how comfortable you are and how long your battery lasts, but do not plan on plugging it. I think, Steve, you had your hand up before. Steve Rebelak, or did you not? It was a while ago.
No, pass.
Okay. Gordon, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I just had, make sure I'm on. Make sure, I had one last comment about the consent agenda this year. A significant number of the members have not met in person. And the consent agenda, I think, dumps a lot on them, even the new members or even old members who have only met remotely. And and also given, as I mentioned earlier, given the context of the articles this year, I don't see the value of the consent agenda. It's moderator's discretion. We spent over half of the first session last year, and it was very frustrating for someone who had spent so much time annotating it, so it would be helpful. I think it might be useful for the body and the new members who have never been in town hall before to just plug through it, and then next year we can go back to a consent agenda. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. So yeah, there will be a consent agenda this year. It'll have, like, in the ballpark of, roughly 30 articles is still being finalized. I'll share it soon. And so last year, Gordon's right, it was particularly painful last year. The I studied that and looked at like, well, what was really taking all this time? And the vast majority of the time was the delay in like kind of waiting for folks, like, because the way the consent agenda works in general, whether we're remote or in person, is that at least the ways that I've seen it done is that the moderator will kind of recite the article numbers that are on the consent agenda. And then members have, town meeting members will have some way of expressing that they want to hold an article, which is to say, remove it from the consent agenda. So it's considered like everything else, taken out of the batch of articles that is the consent agenda. And doing it remotely last year, the procedures were just particularly slow. And so there was confusion around like, well, which article, because of that delay and kind of folks registering their desire to hold. And then additionally, the experiment we tried last year, which was not successful, to require a second to ensure that articles weren't accidentally taken off the consent agenda. That didn't really change anything. Every article that requested a hold was also seconded, so it didn't really matter to have a second. But then there would be confusion about like which article are we talking about here, because someone tried to hold the article that I last mentioned, not the current one, but because of that delay, it was kind of a mess. And this has been painful throughout the remote town meetings, but it's particularly bad last year because of the introduction of the requirement of a second to a hold. So all of the remote issues and the seconding issues will be eliminated. And so I expect that it'll be significantly more efficient this year, especially with folks being able to like verbally say that they want to hold. And we're working out, as I said earlier, the protocols for how someone would call a hold from the satellite room, similarly to what I described about the point of order earlier in this orientation, that would be relayed through the deputy moderator in the satellite room. And so, and we'll try to practice this ahead of time, me and the deputy moderator, once we have one, to see like how quickly we can get the processing of the consent agenda. And if it's still really slow, then I'll consider changes to it next year. Let's see, we've got Mr. Schwartz.
Hi, it's Ed Schwartz, Precinct 11. 13 town meetings or 11 or 10 is far in excess of what we've had in the past. So I am definitely in favor of anything that expedites the process, because I think we are having a harder time finding people who are willing to be town meeting members if we don't have something like the consent agenda. That's it.
So I think we are now beyond the point of training and into a debate that we are probably all going to be holding for the next 10 years of our sitting on town meeting. So perhaps, unless someone has a procedural question or an informational question, we should call it a wrap.
I'm happy to stay on. I don't know if any folks joined after the Precinct 16 meeting, which we conflicted with, which I apologize with about the scheduling of that. But I'm happy to stay on for any questions that folks have, especially if they're not questions about the existence of the consent agenda.
I'm also happy to stay on.
Great. But short of that, I think we are at a wrap this evening. I just want to say thank you to all my fellow trainers, to Pat and to Adam and to Steve and to Susan, and especially thank you to Greg, who really, like, it's above and beyond for him to actually stay at this meeting the whole night, given all of his responsibilities getting ready for a town meeting. So again, unless someone has a question that they want to chat with Greg or Susan about, who are crazy for wanting to stay on, I think we are done.
And you can always feel free to email me anytime. Yeah.
Yes, you will find everybody who spoke tonight on the email list, and you can email us and note who your precinct buddies are, and reach out to them and let them know you're a newbie, if you are. All right. Great, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, folks.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Annie, for
Oh,
being
you're
your
welcome.
MC.
No problem.